And all the woe that moved him so, that he gave that bitter cry, the wild regrets and the bloody sweats, none knew so well as I, for he who lives more lives than one, more deaths than one must die. That's a nice dramatic opening. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, Book Time with Elvis with me, Mark, and another episode of Monday Musings. You may have recognized that little snippet of poetry at the beginning as coming from Oscar Wilde's Ballad of Reading Gaol. It is one of the few snippets or bits of poetry that I can quote, from pulling it out of the vaults of my mind, as it stayed in there as some part of useful/useless information, like a lot of things. But it brings me to the subject of today's Monday Musings, and it's the subject of poetry and whether or not poetry is dead. Are we living in a dead poetry society? Now, if you take a look around YouTube, of course, you'll see loads of people talking about how they write their own poetry. You may see people giving poetry readings. However, I've noticed things like Poetry Thursday. It comes and goes. There's loads of people doing it. There's nobody doing it. It really fluctuates. And you don't really see a lot of people talking about and reviewing a lot of poetical works unless they are classical poetical works. So you'll see people talking about the Aeneid or the Odyssey, Paradise Lost, for example, and that kind of thing. I was trying to look through my books and see what modern poetry I own, and it's almost none. In fact, the only book of modern poetry I own, i.e. that's not a work in translation from some classical poet like Catullus or Ovid or Homer or Virgil or, Milton wouldn't be in translation, of course, but, I have Milton's poetical works. I have Dante, I guess, as well. The only one I've got that's written originally in English and is in the last few years or so is this wonderful book, Dark Passages, Moments of Transition, by our very own Sean D. Standfast, which I still haven't got to, but I plan to. But why my reluctance? Is it because poetry is a medium that just isn't that popular? I don't know. Bear in mind, this is just me talking here. I'm not making any judgments on poetry. I like a lot of poetry. However, I don't read a lot of poetry, really. It's not my go-to thing. I need the poem itself to speak to me, and I don't often like to wade through loads of poems to get to just one that, might speak to me. But it seems all the time people are talking about whether the medium of poetry is dead, dying, etc. There was an article in the New York Times at the end of last year where the author, I'm just going by memory here, the author was wondering whether or not, it said something like poetry died 100 years ago this month, and I believe, if I remember rightly, they laid the blame of this at T.S. Eliot's publication of the Wasteland. I loved a lot of poetry as a child. I like easy poetry, I have to say. I'm not going to lie. Give me something like Shel Silverstein, and that's good fun. I can still remember, I cannot go to school today, said little Peggy Ann McKay. I have the measles and the mumps, a gash, a rash, and purple bumps, etc., etc. Because I did it in school, and we had to do it as part of a kind of school concert thing, and it stuck with me all these years later. In fact, I performed it at school here when we had our poetry competition, which we do have in our little primary school here. However, this is only done in the first, what they call the first stupend, which is classes 1 through 5. So that's like from 6-year-olds to 10-year-olds, something like that. And another reason, this is cropped up is because, again, I was reading The Guardian. You know me and The Guardian and the way it always prompts videos. And originally it was an article where the Waterstones Children's Laureate, Joseph Coelho, was lamenting that we don't teach enough poetry. You know, the title of the piece was "Poetry Can Move Souls and Thrum Hearts. Why wouldn't we teach our children about it?" And this in turn was sparked by an article a day earlier, where it looked at the CLPE, or the Centre for Literacy in Primary Education, in conjunction with Macmillan Children's Books, which carried out a survey in primary schools that found poetry is read aloud less than once a week in 93% of schools in England, and in 20% of schools, poetry isn't even read aloud at all, and some schools only touch on poetry perhaps only once a year. Their stock of poetry books is severely limited, and the teachers themselves say they don't have experience or knowledge enough about poetry in order to be able to teach it, so they don't feel comfortable in doing so. Now, I was lucky. I had a fairly well-rounded education. We had a lot of poetry in our English literature classes, and I'm sure perhaps many of you did as well if you are around my age. And I'm kind of surprised to see that it isn't being taught. But how useful is it? You know, how useful is poetry really? I mean, very often those people who write poetry, myself very occasionally included, maybe do so as more of a personal thing. I mean, I'm sure many of us on BookTube who have, albeit small aspirations to write a bit in our free time, and a lot of it probably isn't meant for publication, or if it is, in perhaps just our wildest dreams. But I'm sure most of us have dabbled at one point or another in poetry, but we don't see perhaps a lot of commercial value in it. Maybe. Do we? I don't know. As I say, I'm just musing here, and I'm wanting your feedback and comments on what you think about the value of poetry in the world today. And of course, when I say the world, that is really quite a narrow term, because I am only really speaking about probably the Western world. I mean, I don't know the state of poetry in other parts of the world. It may be massive still in East Asia. Parts of Africa, it might be thriving like you wouldn't believe. But the thing is, you know, I don't think we often see massive amounts of poetry just out there, you know, in the mainstream, do we? Do we? I mean, maybe I'm missing it because I'm not particularly interested. I might be completely off, and it might be a thriving, well, not industry, of course, but a thriving section of our literary universe. But as I said, I think it is. I just don't think it's out there as much. So I'm sure it thrives in people's. I mean, what about music? I mean, what is music? I was trying to think about that. Is music really just not music? Sorry, songs. Are songs really just poems set to music? I mean, yeah, I don't know. It is very interesting. And as I say, I'm sure some of the people that watch my videos write poetry. I know a couple, of course, who are subscribed, definitely write it and have had it published, and others who publish their own works as well. You know, and it is funny because when I talk about Sean, you know, he of course laments the sales of his book. But it isn't a surprise to me, perhaps, because I think if people are going to purchase a book, they're more likely to purchase, you know, a work of prose, a novel, than a collection of poetry, however wonderful that collection of poetry is. You know, we will see people, of course, reading and talking about classical or ancient works of poetry. But I can probably count on one hand at least the videos of people I subscribe to where I've seen them talk about anything modern, you know. So yeah, it is something I think is very interesting. There was also an article, I think also towards the end of last year in the Times Literary Supplement, where they kind of took the article from the New York Times and kind of joked around with it, because they were saying things, you know, like poetry declared dead again. It seems, of course, it's always being declared dead. In one of these articles, they lamented the fact that poetry is dead or dying because we've lost our connection to the natural world. But, how important is that? Because you can write poetry about anything. It comes from within. It doesn't necessarily have to be influenced by the nature of the world, does it? Like actual nature, listening to, wandering lonely as a cloud and spying a host of golden daffodils. It's not important that you have to wander around. Is it the Peak District he wanders? No, the Lake District he wanders around, isn't it? You don't have to do that to write poetry. You can stay locked in your room and write poetry inspired by the things that you have within your room, of course. Urban poetry, I'm sure, is a thing. I mean, what is rap if it isn't a form of poetry? So it is very interesting. And as I say, I'm very curious as to what your own thoughts and perceptions are of the state of poetry in our world, and whether or not you think we are living in a dead poetry society. By the way, I will just do a little plug and say, do check out Sean's book. I'm sure he'll be very appreciative if you do. But I will leave you with something from the Oxford Student, where I'll quote the end of the article here. Poetry has changed radically. There is no doubt about that, just like its development from oral to written medium, from inscriptions on trees and walls to paper, and then to print following the emergence of the printing press. It has developed in parallel with societal change to be received through technological medium. This is not a sign that it has died, but more a sign that it is very much alive. The fact that it changes with the times to suit human nature is proof of its poignance within civilization, and that will never die. It is central to the human condition. So what do you think about that? Do let me know below. Thank you so much for watching this edition of Monday Musings, and I will see you all again very soon indeed. Bye-bye.